Dr. Subir Gokal, distinguished invitees and participants in the conference, my IGADR colleagues, staff and students. Good morning and welcome to this 14th conference on money and finance in the Indian economy at IGADR. I would like to welcome Professor Bodo, who has kindly agreed to deliver this year's inaugural address. First, we'll offer a bouquet to Dr. Bodo. I would also like to welcome Dr. Subir Gokal, Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India, and thank him for agreeing to chair the inaugural session today. We will now offer a bouquet to Dr. Subir. Now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Michael Bodo. Dr. Bodo is Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Monetary and Financial History at Rutgers University, New Jersey. He has held previous academic positions at the University of South Carolina and Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He has been a visiting professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, Princeton University, Harvard University, Cambridge University, where he was Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions, and a visiting scholar at the IMF, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and Cleveland, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and the Bank of International Settlement. He also is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, Cambridge, Massachusetts. He has MSc from the London School of Economics and received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1972. He has published many articles in leading journals and 10 books in monetary economics and monetary history. He is editor of a series of books for Cambridge University Press, Studies in Macroeconomic History. His recent books include essays on the gold standard and related designs, Cambridge University Press, and also Globalization in Historical Perspective, University of Chicago Press. Today he is going to speak on Wither the Euro, some lessons from the history of fiscal unions. In the context of present Euro debt crisis, particularly in Greece and Portugal, the lessons from history are important for taking appropriate policies and actions. We are indeed fortunate that Dr. Bodo is with us today. Turning to the context of the Money and Finance Conference of IGADR, you all know, research on money and finance in India gained importance after the reforms initiated in 1991. Changes in the monetary design and institutions, more openness, development of debt and equity markets, and initiation of the derivative markets, banking sector reforms, and several other measures raised new questions and policy issues. So this, together with closer linkages and with international research in a more open economy, it has regenerated monetary and financial research in India. With the support of Reserve Bank of India, IGADR took the initiative in bringing together researchers in this area to encourage rigorous work made relevant by interchange with practitioners and policymakers. The first conference, as you know, was held in 1998. It was inaugurated by Dr. C. Rangarajan, who also gave the keynote speech. Since then, we have hosted this conference every year, and this is the 14th one. This year, we received about 99 papers. After screening, we selected 18 papers for presentation at the conference. At this year's conference, we have planned 5 sessions. Each session attempts to address important issues relevant in today's environment. These are 2 sessions on macroeconomics and international trade, 1 on banking and stock markets, 1 on stock markets alone, and 1 session on corporate governance. So we have paper writers from different countries, for example, US, UK, Korea, apart from India. I hope we have stimulating discussions in each of the sessions. As you know, we also have a dinner talk today on Can Indian Banks Innovate by Dr. P. Jayendra Naik, CEO and Country Head, Morgan Stanley, India. With these few words, once again I welcome all of you to this conference. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a really great pleasure to be here. I've had the great fortune of being in India. This is my third trip. So you can tell when Dr. Sabir invited me, I jumped at it. I thought, great, because I really like coming. So this is, for me, it's a treat being here. So I'll let you know. I'm not an expert in economic development, and I don't have the answers to India's problems, but I'm an economic historian. And my approach to everything is economics is through the lessons from the past. My expertise is in monetary and financial history. What I'm going to talk about today is a very big topic for Europe, which is what's going to happen to the Eurozone. And this research that I'm going to talk about comes from a number of papers I've done over the years and a book with Lars Jona, who's a Swedish economist. He used to be, until last year, an official in Brussels at DGF. So we've done a lot. This is sort of summarizing some of our research. So, this is the euro is still struggling through a debt crisis. The Greek crisis may be temporarily on hold with the structured default that was just concluded a couple of weeks ago. And I think what's going to happen is that the austerity that's been forced on that country is going to continue, and there will be a political backlash, and there's an election coming up. And I suspect the ending isn't going to be too good, and they'll probably, but I won't say for sure, but there's a good chance they'll have a real disorderly default, not something that's nicely worked out with lots of people throwing money and lots of arm twisting, etc., which they just did. It'll be a nasty event. That's what I think, but I might be wrong. And I think there's also a chance that they'll get kicked out, or there'll be an exit, let's put it that way, from Europe. Again, that depends on politics, depends on a lot of things. The next country which is in line is Portugal, and that may follow with a structured default. And I feel kind of badly about Portugal in part because one of my very best students was their finance minister for many years. He just left last year, and I know that they're trying, but it's like, this is just off the record. So when they created this monetary union, they mixed up countries at very different levels of economic development. So you got a country like Portugal, which was just going through the textile phase of economic development. Okay? It was a country that was sort of frozen about 1950, 55 in terms of development. And they lined them up with Germany, which is a really advanced country. It's been advanced since the 1870s. And there's a real problem of getting those countries to work together. So this, Greece is a different story. Greece is also one of those countries. Greece has also got almost a first world corruption problem, etc. But Portugal's a little bit, it's a better civil society. So I feel badly for them. But I think that they're going to be the next one that's going to be in bigger trouble. And for the rest of the euro area, the crisis is being presently and probably temporarily alleviated by generous support, liquidity support by the European Central Bank to the banks. There's not a direct subsidy to the countries in trouble. I didn't say anything about Spain or Italy. I think Spain's also going to be in big trouble. Italy probably less so. And Ireland will probably work its way out of this. So there's been this generous fiscal, there's been this generous liquidity by the central bank, European Central Bank. There's a modest fiscal deal that's been working out, some of it, which as my talk will progress, you'll see why that's really what they have to do. There's been some bank recapitalization, and there's some moderate moves towards structural reform. Now, I think the point of this lecture is that many of Europe's woes could have been predicted from what we know about the history of monetary and fiscal unions, and also what we've known for a very long time about the theory of optimum currency areas. We know that from the work of Bob Lundell going all the way back to the early 60s. Ron McKinnon, Peter Kennan, they basically laid out the framework, which was the framework that led to the creation of the euro. And what we know from history is that the creation of successful national monetary unions in the past have always coincided with the setup of a fiscal union as part of the creation of a nation state. I had this book I did a few years ago with Lars Jonan, and we just showed, we looked at a lot of data for a lot of countries, and that was the conclusion we came up with over 10 years ago. And the theory of optimum currency areas, again, developed by Lundell, et cetera, that they posited that a monetary union without full labor mobility is going to require a fiscal authority to make transfers between the subnational units, between the states or the provinces. So this is nothing new. And the interesting thing is that the Europeans embarked on a unique experiment, and they did it for entirely political reasons and driven by the terrible history of Europe in the 20th century and earlier. So they created a monetary union without a fiscal union. Okay, now the people who framed it, okay, those people in the discussions that occurred in the 1980s, 70s, going all the way back, they knew full well about the dangers of it. Okay, there's a new book that's written by a good friend of mine, Harold James, professor of history at Cambridge, coming out of Harvard University Press. It's a beautiful, excellent history book. And he had access to the records of the European central banks, and they had this meeting that took place for 30 years where they discussed European monetary and general integration. And all of the problems came up. They came up 30 years ago. And every time there was this issue that was brought up about fiscal union, it was shoved under the rug. Because no, we can't do that. We have to go for this. And in a sense, I'm not going to get into the story, but there was a horse trade between Germany and France, with the Italians sort of in the wings to work out a deal that was going to go through regardless. And so that this fiscal union story was paramount. Everyone knew it was important, and they just said, no, we can't. Okay. Now, it's not obvious from the history, from the perspective of the present crisis as to whether the euro project's going to succeed. And I'm not going to make that prediction. I won't go as far as Barney Feldstein, although I always agree with almost everything he said on this topic. I'm skeptical. Now, if we heed the lessons from the past, I think it would be important in guiding the European in guiding the European countries in their attempt to move the European integration forward and helping them implement the fiscal foundations that should have been laid a lot earlier. It's possible also that Europe could devolve into a two-speed Europe, reflecting the growing divide in unit labor costs and other key structural variables between the core countries of Germany and the countries that are closely tied in with Germany and the periphery. So I think that may be what will happen too. So what I'm doing in this talk is I'm looking at the history of fiscal unions. I'm looking at four countries. It's sort of a comparative history approach, and with the aim of drawing some useful lessons for the current situation in Europe. And so I'm going to focus on two cases which I think were relatively successful as fiscal unions, and two cases which were not. So two cases which are relatively successful in the US and Canada, and the two less successful ones I'm going to talk about Argentina and Brazil. In my work with Lars, we've talked about other countries, like Germany and Switzerland in there. And just to, again, give you some back, I started on this project in around 2000. I was a visiting scholar at the time. And I was working with this guy, and I forgot his name. I had some, an Indian guy, a Sikh guy, real nice. And we started this project, okay, and I think he was thinking about this, and we were also thinking about India was in the project too. And then what happened was he got promoted from the research department up to fiscal affairs. He didn't have time to finish the paper, so I just kept going. But I forget his name. But someone will remind me, and I apologize for mentioning that, but I did. There's an Indian connection. So these are the countries I looked at. I looked at the United States. And the formation of a fiscal and monetary union in the U.S. After the American Revolution in the 1780s has been regarded by many people as a template for European efforts in union. And I've written about this. Tom Sargent, his Nobel lecture, The War of the Revolution, which was mostly financed by the issue of paper money, fiat money that was called Continentals. And they were issued by the Congress and also by the states. In a sense, the U.S. was started before the revolution. There were 13 colonies, and they basically all of them decided that this is it. You had it traditionally. You guys have been through that. You know what we're talking about. So they wanted to get out. They created this Congress that would be the beginning of a central government. And the problem was that the Congress had virtually no taxing power. And in part that's because one of the reasons for the American Revolution was they were really upset about the way the British taxed them. And so it was very hard to sort of push through a tax to a central authority when the states said, we're not going to do this. And the states had a hard time raising taxes too, because people didn't want to pay taxes. They thought of taxes, they thought of the British. Okay, again, you can sympathize with that. And also, so the states didn't have the tax authority. The central government had none. Okay, and also they had a real problem borrowing. Right? Because you fight a war, there are three ways to pay for it. By borrowing, it's future taxes, present taxes. If you can't do that, you use seniorage, you use inflation. So it was very hard. There was a political resistance to regular taxes. They didn't have much access to the bond market. And again, that reflected two things. One was that nobody knew for sure who was going to win. So like, there were wealthy citizens who could have bought the bonds, but they didn't want to take a chance. Okay, and foreigners meant the Dutch at that time, the French, and the Spanish, all of whom were in some respect enemies of the British. So they were potential lenders, and in fact they did lend, but again there was reluctance. And they didn't start lending until it looked like the Americans were going to win. Okay, so what happened is that it was very hard to borrow, very hard to tax, so they printed paper. Okay, what happened was that they ended up, they won the war. Part of it was because France came in and helped them. I'm a Canadian, so I can take the other side. So the Americans think they won it by themselves, but I think they didn't. They had a lot of foreign intervention. That's okay. But the thing is that they're completely bankrupt. The country had defaulted on its debt, and it wasn't just the country, it was the states too. They defaulted on the debt to the Europeans and the debt to their own citizens. And so they created, the first thing they did was they created the Articles of Confederation. which was a loose confederation of states. And it was based on the principle of a very small, limited central authority. And so in respect what the Americans first did, it's a lot like the Europeans. They didn't want to give up their sovereignty. The states didn't want to give up their sovereignty, so they had like a loose arrangement. Okay, so they'd have some kind of central authority that could deal with diplomatic affairs with the rest of the world, and that's about it. Okay, and then also the army military was largely coming from the militias from the states. And they had virtually no fiscal power. They couldn't raise taxes. So the central government had to go to the states to get the tax money. The states had to agree with unanimity to give taxes to the Congress. They never could agree. Okay, does that sound like Europe? Right? Anytime they want to do anything, all the countries have to get together. So there was a lot of similarities to the Confederation, what the Europeans are still doing today. And the perceived failure of the Confederacy led to the Constitution of 1789, which was a remarkable achievement. And that gave the key thing. This is really about fiscal stuff. Taxation and fiscal stuff is really key, as you know. And so what the Constitution did is it gave the federal government expanded powers in monetary and fiscal affairs, including the ability to raise taxes and the sole right to coin gold and silver currency. So back then, they didn't really have banks, and money supply was really tied to gold, or gold and silver. Okay? And also the Constitution mandated free trade between the states. This was very important too. This is similar to Europe in the sense that they opened up free trade between the European states. And Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury, okay, he put together a plan in April 1790 to restructure the public debt and create deep financial markets. And he was looking at the history of Britain and knew, in the 18th century, the British did a very good job at creating a bond market, which became the foundation for financial development. Okay, it also allowed them to tax food. That is, they could borrow today to fight the wars against France on the assumption that they credibly pay off the debt in the future, and then be able to borrow again. And the British developed this model before any other country. Actually, they followed the Dutch in doing this. And so by the end of the 18th century, Britain had really worked out a pretty good fiscal arrangement. So Hamilton basically just took that on. And so his plan was there were four parts to this plan. One was consolidate the debt, the state and federal debt, get a sufficient tax revenue to service the debt. That's really key. You've got to have the taxes to service the debt. Creating a sinking fund and creating the first bank of the United States, which is like a prototype central bank. Okay. And so the first key element for creating a viable fiscal union was for the federal government to assume the state's debts at par value and consolidate the debts of the states into one type of security, one type of long-term security, which was modeled after the British consols. And that the thought was that to do this, consolidate the debt, and to pay back the debt to foreigners at the par of exchange. So the foreigners, the Dutch and the French to a certain extent, and the other countries, they didn't take a haircut. They weren't defaulted on. The locals were. They did default on the locals because they can't run anything. This is a very important principle. Is if you're going to default, don't default on foreigners. Okay, and this is a point that Reinhard Rogoff talked a lot about that in their current book. And so he thought that by doing this, by creating this bond market, paying off the debt, that this would create an effective capital market, would facilitate government borrowing in the case of future wars. And the key thing, the second thing to get that to really work is taxes. And the idea was you collect sufficient tax revenue to continuously service the debt. And so he proposed a national tariff as well as excise taxes to pay the debt. And the key thing about this, very importantly, is very insightful, is the key form of taxation was going to be tariff revenues. Why is this important? Because you collect the taxes before they land in the states, right? So you've got the Port of Baltimore in Maryland. Okay, there's a federal government tax authority that takes taxes to import directly. The money goes directly to the U.S. Treasury. It does not go to the states. You don't have to work out a deal, go to the states and say, now we need the money, and the states say, sorry, we can't do it. So this was something that they figured out, but Europeans didn't figure that out. This is something that Hamilton figured out. Okay. So, in a sense, what he did was he created something which is what the Europeans call a Eurobond. And it's very important to create a Eurobond. And as I said, he did it in such a way that the taxes would be collected before they went through the states. So it would be like the Europeans setting up an authority in Brussels, which would send Dutch tax collectors into Greece, okay, and collect the taxes. Okay, you wouldn't wait let the Greeks collect the taxes and then pass the money on. Tom Sargent, in his Nobel lecture, he viewed the assumption of the state's debt at par as a bailout, justified by the fact that the state's debts had been incurred to win the war against Hamilton. So he argued that, this first deal was actually a bailout, but it was justified because the states went to a lot of trouble for a just cause. Okay. And he also made this point that I made about how important the tariff was to create the tax revenue that was needed to get the country going, to pay for the military, to pay for diplomacy, and also, key thing, service the national debt. Okay. So he also proposed a sinking fund. The sinking fund has turned out not to be such an important part of his package, but the idea that he had was that you set aside some revenues provided for by specific taxes. So you have a tax, like a tax on alcohol. You use that tax to buy bonds, buy public debt, okay, and then the debt, the interest on the debt is used to acquire more public securities and eventually pay off the debt. And so it's a credibility enhancing mechanism, which in a sense tells the public that there are going to be funds to amortize the debt over time. And then he set up the first bank in the United States. It was really not set up to be a central bank like we think of it. It was more of a government bank that would facilitate a medium-term finance for the government. Also, it would promote economic development, encourage the development of private banks, and would create a uniform currency area, and make sure that the monies issued by banks in different states would all be circulating at the same value. And he set up a national mint to issue coins. So this was the Hamilton package. And what happened in the following years, 30 or 40 years, is that the federal government played a minimal role in the development of the economy. It was, the federal government was small. So its total share of taxes is between 1% and 2%. So it's a little bit bigger than the European budget, but not that much bigger. And this was because back then people really didn't think that the government should play a large role in the economy. The states did, however. The states did play a pretty important role in financing infrastructure. So a key thing for the United States in the early 19th century was the thing that you people are building today, was to try to build a national infrastructure network. And so they built canals first, and they put canals on all the navigable waterways in the eastern part of the country. And a lot of these were financed by bonds issued by the states. Okay, also, the states set up banks, state banks, which were used directly to pay for the canals. And then when the railroads came along, they did the same thing. And then the bonds that they issued for the canals, they basically sold them to the British. So there was a major capital inflow that started into the U.S. very early in the 19th century. And what happened was that some of the states didn't do a very good job of raising taxes to service the debt. But the major source of taxation was property tax. And the assumption was, in many of the states, was that with the economic development, this is a cautionary tale, I know you don't do that here, the cautionary tale, that they believed that as the economy developed, the tax base would increase and they'd be able to service the debt. So that even though they didn't have the money lined up, they didn't have the tax revenue lined up when they took out the loans, they thought that it would be fine, the economy would grow and the money would be there. Okay, so what happened was that there was a crisis like the one we just went through in 1837. In fact, in the 19th century, there were lots of crises, very similar to the one we just went through. Okay, in this one, the one we just went through, which isn't the subject so much in my talk, okay, but I've written a lot about it, is really caused by events in the United States. So in my way of thinking, the subprime mortgage crisis is the reason why the world went into crisis. Okay, I don't attach as much importance to China global imbalance. I really think it had a lot to do with U.S. government policy, the Federal Reserve, etc. Okay, well now flashback to the 19th century. Who's creating the problems for the rest of the British? Okay, London's the center for world capital. Right? Bank of England is the agency that's pulling the levers. So the crisis of 1837 was a really bad crisis. It was the second big global financial crisis. It started in London and it spread to the peripheral world. The United States is the peripheral world. So there's a major banking crisis in the United States. Many banks fail. There's a suspension of payment. What happens? The economy goes into the tank. Okay, the governments of 10 states cannot come up with the revenues to service their debt. They know they're going to default. They go to the federal government and they say, look, you guys helped us out in 1789. We're in big trouble now. Can you help us out? The Congress said, and the executive said, sorry, we're not giving you any money. Back in 1789, okay, you borrowed money for a just cause. Now, you went ahead, built canals, and you didn't possibly, put the resources aside. So 10 states defaulted on their debt. What did that mean? It meant that the British bondholders got hit. The British reacted by saying, we're not lending any money to the United States. That doesn't just mean the 10 states that were in trouble, it meant the whole country. So the federal government didn't have access. It couldn't sell its bonds abroad either. And so this is a big problem. And that was a lesson. And it was a lesson because the states reacted to this being cut off by in a sense, taking care of themselves. And gradually over time, it all didn't happen, so gradually over time, the states adopted balanced budget rules. The story is different in every state. Basically, they would either, have the budget had to be balanced, all the time, or they had some kind of a rainy day fund that could deal with it. But all the states except one, Vermont, developed balanced budget rules. Nobody really knows why Vermont didn't do that, but they're one of the most fiscally sound states, and they never got into trouble. Okay? And it's interesting that in subsequent years, okay, this is like the crisis occurs in 1841, Okay, in the next 110 years, or the next 100 years, there are problems. And many of the states did default. The southern states all defaulted after the Civil War. And in the Great Depression, as the state of Arkansas, they did not get bailed out. So this is very important. The federal government has never bailed out the subnational governments. Well, then the rest of the story that I'm just going to mention fairly quickly for the United States is that that the Great Depression is the next big shock, and the states are really in big trouble, and they really can't handle the fiscal affairs. And so the New Deal, the Roosevelt's New Deal, led to the growth of big government, since they created the fiscal transfers and what's sort of modern-day fiscal federalism, kind of thing that exists in many fiscal federal states. And this involved transfers by the states that were hit by asymmetrical shocks. So I wanted to talk about the second country. I won't talk as long, and that's Canada. So Canada, and there are a lot of similarities between the two countries. They share the same continent. They come from the same colonial background. But the evolution of the federal system in Canada is contrasts quite significantly with that of the States. The British North America Act, which created the Canadian Federation, gave the federal government a lot more power, fiscal power, than the Americans had when they started being up as a nation. So Canada the central government had some more power. And also the Canadian legal system, and had strong ties to Britain, was very much the British system. There were lots of tight connections with the British. So they developed very early a national bond market, which was quite comparable to what Alexander Hamilton did. They didn't have to go through a lot of the crisis that the U.S. did. And they created, a taxing authority to service their debt. And for Canada, you didn't have these banking crises. Canada had a very different monetary history from the U.S. They never had a banking panic, ever. In the last recession we just went through, the Canadian banks sailed through without any trouble at all. I have a paper I did with a couple of colleagues that explained why the Canadian banking system hasn't had the problems of the United States. I don't have time to go into that. Okay, so they did just fine. And the key event for them was the Great Depression, which was a very serious event. The Great Depression was the turning point for Canadian economic policy. And the federal government became much more interventionist, and they set up legislation, a lot like the U.S., a lot like the New Deal, set up a system of fiscal transfers and equalization payments. And the system is set up in the mid-30s, and it has worked fairly well. Okay, but there was one set of problems that Canada did face of interest, and that is in the 1980s and 1990s, a number of provinces had excessive debt, leading to risk premium in the bond markets, international bond markets, and downgrading of their bond ratings. And what they did was they responded to market forces and they reduced their debt. And it's interesting that Canada, which is different from the U.S., they don't have an explicit no bailout clause. Okay, and actually there was one case in the 1930s when a province, Canada, Alberta, became bankrupt, turned to the federal government, and wanted a bailout. The federal government said, okay, we're going to impose conditionality on it. They did what the IMF does, and the province was unwilling to go with the conditionality, so they defaulted. Okay, so the lesson, the story is different than the U.S. It's like when you think U.S., Canada, it wasn't quite the same. Okay, in fact, the way the Canadian system evolved is the market works. So the market, the spreads are quite variable between the provinces. And so it's interesting that the Canada is a fiscally relatively fiscally prudent country. And if you look at this, what's relevant to the European story is that, so in the 1980s and 1990s, when you look at the spreads on Canadian government, provincial government debt, you find there were quite wide divergences, okay, reflecting their different fiscal state of affairs. Okay, so compare that to Europe. Okay, once the Eurozone got going, okay, in the early 2000s, the spreads between Portugal, Spain, Greece, etc., which had been really enormous, they all snapped together, boom, straight line, until the recent crisis. What does that tell me? That tells me that there was, in a sense, that people believed that there would be bailouts. But even though the Maastricht Treaty had no bailout clause, the markets did not believe it. Okay, then the crisis comes, the spreads open up. What does that tell me? It tells me the markets woke up and said, hey, wait a minute, things aren't as what we thought, and Greece isn't as good as Germany. Okay. Also, there's another thing which I think was going on, and that is there was initially some fear of default, but in recent months the spreads have come down, and this likelihood reflects this reflects the likelihood of bailouts. That's actually seen in the two financial stability mechanisms that the Europeans have set up. Also, it could reflect some real fiscal entrenchment. We'll see how long that lasts. And it reflects ample liquidity. Okay, let me compare these two relative success cases to two countries which weren't. So Argentina is a federal republic. It's got 24 provinces. It, in some respects, tried to set up a system a lot like the U.S. Its fiscal history has been characterized by excessive debt, high inflation, and defaults. I wrote a paper 15 years ago with Carlos Bay, who's an Argentinian economist. It was called "What Would Have Happened If Alexander Hamilton Had Been Argentinian?" Okay, paper got an enormous amount of hits. Put it out as an NPR working paper. It was like a really big hit. It was very popular. And the story we told was, you know, the Argentines set up shop. They copied the American system exactly. Okay, they set up a central bank. They consolidated debt, national debt. They borrow money from the British. They had a sinking fund, the whole thing. Okay, within 10 years, they looted the sinking fund. The federal government took the reserves, the gold reserves from the central bank, and they defaulted on their debt to the British. Okay, and then the story we tell is, and this is the story of the 19th century, of periods of you know, getting back on the wagon and drinking a lot. So that was their history. And there's nobody here from Argentina. I don't think any with respect. Anyway, so it's been characterized by excessive debt, high inflation, and defaults. And one of the problems is the fiscal federal system. So, for example, in the 1980s, the provinces borrowed excessively from the provincial banks, who then discounted the debt of the central bank, and that led to hyperinflation. So there was no control of the central government over the provinces. There was no bailout. There was no discussion of a no bailout clause, and there was no mechanism. And the states knew this. They knew that they needed to borrow. They could borrow as much, and they knew that the federal government would take over, and the central bank would take over from that. Okay, and so this was the history of Argentina. And then they had the Convertibility Act, a law of 1991, creating a currency board, which was very successful in reducing inflation. Okay, there was a fixed exchange rate, a currency board tied to the dollar. Okay, but what they didn't do was work out the fiscal federal plan. They didn't do what Alexander Hamilton and then the U.S. Congress did. Okay, and create some mechanism that would limit what the provinces or the states could do. Okay, and so what happened to the convertibility law, you know, a key problem, wasn't the only problem, was that many of the states were spending a lot, borrowing a lot, okay, and the federal government was paying for it. Okay, and so this led to a general debt crisis, attack on currency. In 2002, there's a debt default, currency crisis, and a huge banking crisis. Argentina went through a very serious recession that lasted for about 8 years. Argentina never had a bailout or a well-functioning fiscal union. Still doesn't. Okay, my last case is Brazil. And the Brazilian Federation, created in 1889, was 26 states, the federal district, and lots of municipalities. So it was very complicated with 3 levels in it. Okay. What happened was that initially the federal government had more power, then there was a shift gradually towards the subnational units. And the problem that Argentina had repeated itself in Brazil. So they had 3 major state-led debt crises, which the federal government then, in a sense, had to solve. And so they had national defaults and bailouts. And the last crisis in 1999 led to a law, fiscal responsibility law, which greatly increased federal government controls over subnational forms. It gave the federal government a lot of power that they had to approve before the states could go. They had to have approval by the federal government. And so I was thinking about India, and I read a few things, but not enough. I thought there's some similarities with Brazil. I think India doesn't fit in very well into the other cases. Okay, but I don't know enough to tell you the problems that you guys have faced, and maybe we can talk about that later. But I think that's a lesson. So let me tie this lecture up in the next 5 minutes. So what are the lessons that we get from the history of fiscal unions for the euro area? Okay, so the first lesson that I take away, and I'm not necessarily saying it's the most important, but it's the first lesson, is that you need a central tax authority to service national debt, and you need national debt to smooth taxes and fund necessary government expenditures. Okay, especially when you have wars or when you have a huge national shock like the Great Depression. And so I take the history of fiscal unions as making a strong case for something like a Eurobond to be serviced by taxes collected by a pan-European fiscal authority, and that the authority and access to these bonds will then allow the central government to transfer resources between member states in the case of large shocks which are not distributed perfectly symmetrically. So in a sense, I think that had the Europeans had something like that in place, okay, that a lot of the, I mean, you know, we can blame the Greeks for what they did, we can blame the Irish for their housing boom, etc. So we can play the blame game, or we can say that, look, it's a big shock, a huge crisis, a recession, largely imposed by the United States. So some parts of Europe did better than others, so there would have been transfers. Okay, now sure, Spain had a housing boom, Ireland had a housing boom, and there would have been the shock. The effects on them would have been worse regardless. But there still was this asymmetric shock, which could have been dealt with. Okay, and I think that a fiscal authority and a Eurobond would have been able to handle some of the problems caused today by the debt crisis in the peripheral countries. It would have had a lot more firepower to head off contagion, which of course is a big thing they worry about, than this temporary European Financial Stability Fund that was set up, and the proposed European Stability Mechanism. So it would have solved all this problem of trying to invent something on the fly requiring unanimity, which has been really, really a big problem. It hasn't worked very well. And moreover, the euro area would not have required outside support from the IMF. Okay? And since the IMF really wasn't set up for the euro, not since the 1960s or 70s, the IMF has been set up to deal with the problems of emerging. A second lesson is the importance of a credible no bailout clause. And that may even be the key lesson. Okay, and the U.S. example is the most striking. I mean, since the 1840s, the federal government has never bailed out a subnational authority. The balanced budget provisions in state constitutions are instituted by the states by themselves, okay, and have been largely false. And it wasn't the federal government that imposed the laws, it's the states, so they were endogenous. Okay, and I think that's very important because you don't get into these sovereignty issues. But of course, it's not perfect. So one of the negative consequences of strict one of the consequences of strict adherence to a balanced budget rule is that when there's something happens, like a recession like we just had, then the states are going to get hit hard. Okay, so fiscal policy in the state tends to be pro-cyclical. And what they didn't do, what they talked about doing, and done in a very ineffective way, is set up a rainy day fund. Because there's a tendency to set up these funds and then loot them and not use them. And when they're there, and then when the recession comes along, there's nothing there. So they need some mechanism that, for example, that they could set up a credible rainy day fund. The states would deposit some percentage of their tax revenues, and it would be administered by an independent federal authority. Okay, something like the Supreme Court. There was some way the states couldn't touch it, and the federal government couldn't also dip into the money to deal with their problem. Is that is one way that they could alleviate their imbalance. The third lesson is the importance for the monetary union of creating a viable fiscal regime. The discounted present value of future taxes must equal the present value of government expenditures and debt service. And when you violate that intertemporal budget constraint, that then the public debt becomes explosive. This is the lesson that we got from a famous paper by Tom Sargent, Wallace, called Some Unpleasant Fiscal Arithmetic, Monetarist Arithmetic. And the examples of Latin America show you that, they show you that the monetary authorities were forced to fund the domestic debt, creating high inflation. So you know from this lesson that to the extent the debt is denominated in foreign currency, you're going to have a default. If it's denominated in domestic currency, you're going to have inflation. And if you have a fiscal federal system where there are no controls, then it's going to come about by the provinces, states, etc., causing the central government to either default or hyperinflate. Okay. And so to have a successful monetary union, you need a successful fiscal union. And someone has paraphrased Milton Friedman, who said in the 1990s, in the 1970s, he talked about it's money, money matters. Okay, they paraphrased it as saying, no, it's fiscal. You need to get the fiscal house in order before you can even get the money part. So the key thing is that, the fourth lesson before I get to the last one. The fourth lesson from the history of fiscal unions is that the defining moment for the development of modern fiscal federalism in the advanced countries was the Great Depression. That was the event that they worked it out. Okay, perhaps the recent current European debt crisis following the Great Recession will be the defining moment for the Europeans, and they'll work it out. I'm skeptical, but it's possible. But the last point I want to make is that behind the successful historical experiences of national fiscal and monetary union lies a deep political commitment by all of the member states to the national state. And whether the euro area will ever move far enough in the direction of a successful fiscal union depends on the willingness of the member states to commit to the notion of a common European political entity and to subsume national sovereignty to it. And I think this is what the future will reveal. In fact, if they're willing to really do that, then I think the future will be very good for them. If they don't, I wouldn't bet too much on it. So thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah. Ladies first.
Given that business side is not single. Now, when you are proposing, if I understand, common European bond financed by taxes. Now, assume that business cycle is not synchronized with Europe. Who pays the tax? I mean, let's assume that Germany is growing at 5.5% a year, and Ireland is not growing. Where does the tax go?
The tax burden falls on the subnational units that are doing better. So it's asymmetric. Okay? Everybody's paying taxes, but you pay more because the taxes are related to the. I mean, there's a way you could set it up so the taxes are related to the level and the growth of income. So there's a this is how it works. So the bonds are being serviced more by those subnational units that are doing better, and what the bonds can then do is to make sure that you could deal with crises that come along. You could either use it to set up a Euro-wide financial authority, which they didn't do, okay, as well as to have these transfers, these fiscal transfers. And the bond also gives you the ability to set up your own Euro-wide diplomatic service, military, etc. So the bond gives you the ability to set up the state, okay, and to continue it through crises. So it's a pooling mechanism. But it's different than what a lot of Europeans have proposed. So they propose that you take the existing bonds that are denominated in euros, you take the Greek bonds and the Portuguese bonds, you aggregate them all together, and you sell it as a common bond market. And the Europeans don't like this. Why? The Germans don't like it at all. Because they know that they're taking on the debt. They're just saying, okay, you know, we've got German debt, but now we're going to have everybody else, and it's all part of Germany because we're paying for it. So this mechanism has the advantage of in a sense, having everybody paying the taxes, even though the taxes are not going to be proportional. I mean, you can't have it proportional. You can't have, you know, Germany and Greece paying the same total tax rate. So there's got to be, there's a quid pro quo.
Some trick shots. So there you do have these stability funds and so on. So do you think these two important ingredients are there? Then, you know, we might see that it works out going forward without a full fiscal union.
I mean, that's what the Europeans think. Maybe. I'm a little bit skeptical of it. I mean, for example, this temporary EFCF and then the more permanent one, they're really tied in with a lot of other things. They're tied in with the IMF, for example. So they aren't, they haven't worked out a mechanism to finance them. It's like each country decides this is what we're going to do. And you need unanimity to make sure that it's going to work. So I'm a little skeptical that that's going to be enough. Okay? I think it's a step in that direction. And also that, and they've moved it a bit more in the direction of imposing discipline on the states, but on the subnational government. But I think that the discipline is going to be hard to enforce. Okay, and so, for example, the European problems of the unraveling of the Eurozone started in 6 or 7 years ago when Germany and France violated the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact, and they were told that your deficits are running higher than 3%, and they basically didn't do anything about it. Okay, so in a sense, well, what could they do about it? So, and even though they think they've set up a mechanism, I suspect that if they really start to enforce it, say we are going to collect taxes, that the sovereigns are going to block it. They're going to block it through the European Supreme Court. They're going to come up with ways not to pay. Okay, and so I'm very skeptical that the mechanism is going to work. So that's why I'm thinking they need other much more, in a sense, constitutional safeguard to put in place. Yes, guy in the back.
The recent LTRO program by the ECB, as well as the huge amount of quantitative easing that has been done by the US and UK, is there a danger of that getting reflected into an inflationary situation in the near term, sir? And why is it that so far it is not reflecting this yet?
Okay, that's an extremely good question. I think that the quantitative easing in both the U.S. and in Europe has really had a lot to do with, in a sense, covering up problems, and maybe in Europe especially, and the U.S. too. And unless the structural and the deep structural imbalances are worked out, I'm not 100% convinced that's going to be enough. And the European thing is most worrisome. I mean, I can talk about the U.S. I have very set views on that one, but say focus on Europe first. In the European case, they're creating imbalances by propping up banks that are likely to be otherwise likely to fail. So they're creating a situation of potential zombie banks, like happened in Japan. So that I'm not sure is going to work. We really need the banks to work out their problems, and we need to work out some kind of a Euro-wide financial mechanism, which they're doing. I think it's not there yet. The U.S. case, that's a different story. Okay, I can go on to that one. I think that we don't need the quantitative easing we're getting now. We don't need. I think it's already done enough. I think the economy is on the road to recovery, and I think there is a risk of inflation. Okay? And I don't think that looking at the output gap, which is what they look at, is really telling you what's going to going on in the future. I think there's some major measurement issues here that the Fed is ignoring. I worry about inflation coming through global inflation, coming through the carry trade, coming through China, coming through Brazil, and coming in the back way through the balance of payments in the U.S. Okay. I think that there are some big problems coming up in the future for the United States, and those problems are going to be much more on the side of too much money being printed rather than not enough.
Thank you.
Great.